Hi there, everyone. I'm just delighted to be able to introduce you today to Mirte Gosker, who is the current managing director of the fantastic international organization that we all know and love, the Good Food Institute, APAC in particular, so the Asia Pacific region. Mirte, you have such a fantastic track record in universities, in research. You've got international development qualifications, and you have founded an amazing altruistic organization, benevolent fund that I will let you talk about and want to ask you about later. How did all your wonderful experience and qualifications get you to the Good Food Institute?
Thank you, Lisa. I started out indeed in academics in humanitarian logistics at business school in INSEAD. But got kind of infected with the entrepreneurial bug, being surrounded by all these entrepreneurial-minded MBAs. So I started to run my own company, and then within the early days of the startup community in Amsterdam, I joined an accelerator. I started a boot camp, worked with them for a couple of years from Amsterdam, started to look at the European operations, then moved to Singapore, ran the first program here in Singapore. Singapore is small. Singapore is not specifically well known for being a philanthropic hub or anything. So with my ex-husband and his late grandfather, we started the family foundation. But from there, I started to look into impact measurement. Right after our initial plan, we looked into impact measurement and realized we could do much better. And that was because I came across the effective altruism community. And the effective altruism community doesn't only have like a whole philosophy about how you can do good better with donations, with like philanthropy, but also with your career. And that was basically how I started to really rethink my career and what I could do with like my limited skill set. GFI APAC at the time was quite small. I loved their cause, and that is how I got introduced to them.
Can you tell us why does the Good Food Institute exist?
The main reason we exist is that we want alternative proteins no longer to be alternative. So we are a think and do tank, founded 8 years ago, I think, in America. And we're now active in Brazil, in Europe, in Israel, in India, and in Asia Pacific. And what we do, we work with 3 programmatic pillars that I can explain a little bit more about later. But what we basically try to do is take away the hurdles for the alternative protein industry to grow to its full potential. And the reason that we're doing that is because industrial animal agriculture is incredibly bad for the environment, for the animals, for public health, and also for food security.
Mirte, what does the Good Food Institute in the Asia Pacific region think of as the greatest immediate challenge we face in transforming our food system down this side of the world?
We simply cannot continue to consume the amount of meat and produce, while we produce meat the way we currently do, with a growing population, right? So by 2050, we are expected to have 10 million people on the planet. Majority will be in our region, like the growth is coming from here. And while we see that per capita consumption of meat is not as high yet, once the APAC population catches up on per capita meat consumption that we see in Europe and in America, that is just completely unsustainable. We simply have not enough earth, not enough land on planet Earth to grow enough feed for the animals to then slaughter the animals and eat them. So the conversion rate for animal feed is really large, right? For chicken, which is the most efficient animal that we eat, is already 9. So 9 calories of chicken feed in order to get 1 calorie of chicken meat out. And for pigs and cows, that ratio is much higher. So we're currently using the land mass the size of India plus China times 2 plus Indonesia to simply grow, feed, and to graze the animals. That is unfortunately not possible in the future if we need to feed 2 billion people more.
Thank you. And it's the message that I hear resoundingly from all of the experts I speak to around the world. And I suppose for me in little old Western Australia, it's frustrating, Mirte, because I think people assume that I'm out on a ledge here doing really weird stuff that nobody really understands why I'm on about it. But we're a very rich country with a lot of food, and we have a meat consumption which is incredibly high, right up there with America and the UK. So while we're part of the APAC region, we are certainly the developed part, and our meat consumption is unsustainably high in my view. So I'm really interested in what your knowledge in this area tells you the best role that Australia has to play helping the Good Food Institute's pathway to find a better solution for food.
Thank you for asking that question. I think Australia, like Singapore and Japan and South Korea, is perfectly positioned to play a big role in the transition. Because right now, the products that are out there, the plant-based products, the cultivated meat products, they are not, especially the plant-based products, not tasty enough, not nutritious enough, but much more expensive. So we need governments to pitch in. Because for alternative proteins, I would say it's not that we need to go completely back to the drawing board, but we're just not there yet. So we need more innovation. We need more scientific studies to fix some of the problems that we still have, whether it's taste, whether it's nutrition, whether it's texture of these products. And for that, we need funding. And that funding doesn't come from VCs, because VCs, they want a quick return. And what the sector needs is patient capital that's a little bit more creative, maybe, that comes from nonprofits, from governments, from a mixture of that. And therefore, Australia is very well positioned because, like you said, it's a very rich country. It has very good scientific institutions like CSIRO. There are already a couple of really well-known and good startups in the field. You also have a lot of production capacity. So I think that Australia has a quite unique position, very different from Singapore, where I am based, where we have no land available, right, for any kind of production.
The great thing about Singapore, from my perspective as an Australian, though, Mirte, is that the government has a long-term plan to be self-sufficient in food. You can't do that without complementary or alternative proteins, Brit. I've watched Singapore stalking every major country who is doing work in this area so skillfully to develop the country's own strategic direction in this space. For Australia, you probably would have had a look at the paper that I recently released called Transforming the Food System. That's specifically talking to Western Australian government about what we need to do. It's not rocket science. We need to get our collective act together. We need to get the departments who are involved in food and the production process, climate action, innovation, food technology, all of those players need to come together and actually form a view about how to best move forward a food system which is more sustainable and which doesn't contribute to 37% of global greenhouse gases, as we know the current animal food production base industry does. And I totally agree from what I'm seeing with some of our new startups and from what I hear from America and others where they've got lots of innovation happening, is that it's the VCs are very keen to get on board with the flashy, sharp, creative end of R&D. But then when you say, well, we actually need a 10-acre factory and a whole bunch of equipment to continue to, to upscale all this, the money isn't so easy to come by. So that is definitely an area that I've also called on our government to get behind. I'd like to segue a bit because something you told me at the beginning, you referred to your foundation that you co-founded and now co-chair of the Vanderes Foundation. And given my background is in NFPs and charities as well, I'm really, really keen to hear about Vanderes' history and effective altruism. So I would really like to hear about your journey with Vanderes and how did effective altruism fit into that?
It was the wish of my late grandfather, or my ex-husband's late grandfather, to be completely correct, to set up a foundation as his legacy, focus on education. Because his idea was that education can basically break the chain of poverty. And then we started to think, how can you create the biggest impact? finally, we ended with funding either via loans or via investments of social entrepreneurs that were giving student financing to students in lower GDP countries. And whether there was like a student loan or a visa, which is a future income shared agreement. So you basically say, okay, I'm paying for your study. If you end up earning a lot of money, you'll pay back 5%, and if you earn a little money, you will still pay back only 5% of your salary. So they would never get into like a loan program after graduation. So we did that in Colombia, in Ghana, Myanmar, Philippines, Indonesia. And then after we felt like, hey, we figured this out, we know what we're doing, and we can open our foundation to raise more funds and increase our impact, I started to look into impact measurement. And that is a very complicated matter. That's why people are actually educated for this, to be able to do that, because it's nothing that you can just figure out from your kitchen table, I think. I was so intrigued by how the effective altruism community looks at impact. So it's a philosophy or a movement that came out of Oxford University and uses really like reason to think about impact. And I know the movement has had quite a bit of negative publicity in recent years. It's often seen as like cold-hearted philanthropy. But for me, to be honest, it is actually like you're taking out the ego. So it's not doing something because it makes you feel good or it makes somebody else feel good, but because you actually looked at it and thought about how can I make the biggest impact possible. So the idea is that the problems are big, solvable, and neglected, because your additional dollar will go a longer way if it's a neglected problem because nobody else focuses on it. We completely shifted our strategy. We still didn't want to give away everything in one go, because we believe that if we invest smart and we get returns, then over time, obviously, we will be able to give away more and therefore make more impact. So that is how we currently do it. So we use investor specialists who are trying to make our core capital grow as fast as it can. And then all those returns we give away, usually to the effective altruism funds, because those funds are run by people who are really scouting for the most effective interventions. And then we're looking at reducing suffering overall.
So that was fascinating. I'm sure you're aware that effective altruism is integral in helping at least one of our major advocacy groups on animal welfare in Australia. It seems to me that it would be pretty clear why they would choose an animal welfare group to put so much investment in, because the changes that we need to see happening in the world on this planet with human consumption and with the way we treat animals are integrally linked together, and you simply cannot do one without the other. And I must say, in my darker moments, I think it'll be pretty hard to envisage how we as a species can survive unless we address all three of those priorities. So I'm in love with effective altruism. They sound like an amazing organization. And for your Vanderes Foundation too, that is just the most heartwarming and wonderful explanation about an organization coming from startup into a maturity, having a very, very hard look at itself, a really close analysis of its own processes and its own output, and then coming to an agreement that you needed to change. Interesting, because I'm often asked about social impact and measuring impact, and the UN probably is one of the bodies, I would argue, that leads in that space in terms of research into current contemporary practice around that outside of academic institutions. And I often refer people, I say, just go on the site and have a look at what the UN's doing this week. Mirte, I do have one special question that I'd like to ask before I say goodbye. If it was one superpower I could give you to support and advance your work, what you're really passionate about in this life, what would that be?
Good question again. I actually think it would be a photographic memory, because by now we see so many reports coming out from the World Bank, from like a lot of like very credible organizations basically backing us up, right? But I would love to just be able to replicate all those numbers like this, because when I'm talking to like government leaders, to philanthropists, it's just great to have all those numbers because they're so compelling. And if it's not just us saying this, independent organizations, well-respected organizations sharing these numbers of how alternative proteins is simply one of the best, most tractable solutions to get to a sustainable food system and reach the Paris climate goals. Because without alternative proteins, it's not going to happen. So I think that would be helpful in my negotiations.
Total recall, no problem. I will put the message through and we'll see if we can get you that. Trying to keep up with the pace of change is so challenging and somewhat distressing for us here in WA who are trying to work on change and keeping up with the agenda. Sometimes I think that the most important job that people like I can do is to try and open people's ears to what the facts are and what is coming so that they at least start to hear the conversations. You are amazing. Thank you for all you're doing with GFI and with the Vanderes Foundation. Surely your contribution will stand in the history books as something significant, not just for Singapore, but for the whole APAC region. I really look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. You're too kind.